All right, so I guess we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and do the opening remarks or welcome to the event, and then I'll talk a little bit about format, and we'll just uh, begin the event and then end with a Q&A. All right, so first, my name is Erin Mayo Adam. I'm the new director of the LGBTQ Policy Center at Hunter College's Roosevelt House. And I'm thrilled to be able to do our second in-person event or hybrid event of, I guess, since of the year, but since the pandemic. And we're really delighted to have all of you in the audience with us today, especially. So I'm going to be co-moderating the event today with Jake Nill. And our discussion is going to be on the end of the ban on walking while trans in New York, an anti-loitering law that critics argued was used by law enforcement to harass queer and trans people of color. Tonight's event will bring together activists and policymakers who are part of one of the most successful cross-community coalitions in the state to discuss the incredible work they did to repeal the law and the new work they are doing on decriminalization policy in the state. And I will say it's very rare to have a coalition that not only passes a law like the repeal of the walking while trans ban, but also work on new policy so quickly afterwards. So we're really thrilled to be able to talk with them about that today. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists and my co-moderator. First, we have the Honorable Jessica Ramos. Jessica Ramos is a state senator for the 13th District in Queens. As chair of the Senate Committee on Labor, she has passed legislation to grant farm workers basic rights, tackle child poverty, and secure $2.1 billion to create a fund for workers who have been excluded from pandemic-related relief. Those are massive policies all on their own. Senator Ramos was one of the Senate's most outspoken advocates for the repeal of the ban on walking while trans. And for her work on behalf of the LGBTQ community, Ramos has received awards from the New Visions Democratic Club, Powhatan Democratic Club, and the Lesbian and Gay Democratic Club of Queens. So we're really excited to have Jessica Ramos with us. Next, we have Jared Trujillo. Jared Trujillo is policy counsel with the NYCLU and serves on the Decrim NY Steering Committee. Decrim NY is a coalition that advocates for the decriminalization of sex work and the empowerment of sex workers, and one of the primary community organizing vehicles behind the repeal of the walking while trans ban. In addition to his legal work, Trujillo gives speeches and provides community education throughout New York on decriminalizing queerness and the impact that over-incarceration and over-policing have on queer and trans communities. So we're really excited to have Jared Trujillo with us as well. And we also had T.S. Candy with us in the program. Unfortunately, she had a last-minute emergency and had to cancel. However, we're really excited to have the panelists we do have here, and we know, although we'll be missing her contributions, that we'll still have a wonderful discussion of the policy itself and then new policy in the future. And then finally, I'd like to spend a brief moment introducing my co-moderator, Jake Nill. Jake Nill is the program coordinator for the LGBTQ+ Student Center at City College of New York, CUNY. He graduated from CCNY Colin Powell School with a BA in political science and double minors in community change studies and women and gender studies, and has a master's degree from the Queen College's Urban Affairs Master's Program. As a graduate student, Jake's thesis, Hidden Rainbows, was a call to action toolkit for New York City's elected officials to understand and act upon issues affecting LGBTQ+ homeless and street-involved youth, including the further decriminalization of sex work. So for tonight's event, Jake and I have prepared a series of questions, and we've prepared them in the following format. We're going to begin sort of with just general questions about the repeal of the walking while trans ban and what it is and what work you've done on it. And then we'll talk more specifically about that legislation and other legislation that has come out of that. And after we do those things, we'll move on to a Q&A, and we'll open the Q&A with our Vice President of the Hunter College Queer Student Union, Ariana Ahmed. So that's tonight's event, and that'll be about 10 to 15 minutes before we end. So let's go ahead and begin with Jared Trujillo. He'll ask our first question.
So I think we should definitely set the framework as far as what does the walking while trans ban entail. So I wanted to ask you all, can you explain what the ban on walking while trans is, and how did this statute disproportionately affect Black women and Black trans women in New York State?
Sure. So walking while trans, it's also known as loitering for the purpose of prostitution, Penal Law 24037. This is a law that was on New York's books dating back to 1976. And the reason that this bill was put onto New York's books was because we wanted to clean up Times Square. Clean up so often means displace Black people, displace brown people, to hide the people that we don't find, the people whose humanity we just don't respect enough. And that's exactly what this bill did. So from the inception of the statute being on the books, it enabled police officers to go up to people that were oftentimes just minding their own business. People that, and by people, I mean Black and brown women in particular, too often trans folks, too often non-binary folks. And to harass, law enforcement would harass people for simply having the audacity to exist in public spaces. These are people that are waiting for a friend outside of a club so that they can walk together for safety. These are people that are trying to hail down a cab. These are people that are waiting for a bus. These are, again, just people that were doing nothing wrong but existing. And because of this law, it just gave police officers just an expansive ability to go up to people. Now, one of the issues with this law is even though it is a loitering statute, it's not even in the same part of the penal code as other prostitution-related statutes. Because it has prostitution attached to it, is what we call a crime involving moral turpitude. Seriously. Yeah, it's ridiculous. And also, in my other life, I'm a law professor, and I promise I will not bring that energy in here today and bore you all. But what crime involving moral turpitude means more than anything else is that it is a deportable offense. So you have people, again, Black women, brown women, a lot of, and specifically in Jackson Heights, where the senator represents, a lot of trans Latina women in particular. You have people that are already living really marginalized existences that can get this arrest. And this arrest can, first of all, having an arrest is bad in and of itself. Going to court is terrible and traumatizing in and of itself. But it means it can also have collateral consequences for employment, collateral consequences meaning even after you leave jail, further consequences that happen to you. So it can be harder to get a job having this offense on your record. It can be harder to get housing having this offense on your record. Again, because that prostitution is attached to it, it makes it particularly hard to get housing. It makes it hard to find childcare for this. And because it's a crime involving moral turpitude, it can make you deportable. Deportable for simply existing in a public space. So that is what this bill was. I can talk a little bit more. I can also stop ranting. Would you want me to talk like what the campaign was? Or?
Yeah, actually, that's my next question, so that's perfect. My next question is, can you describe the work you did to repeal the walking while trans ban in New York? And this is both in terms of lobbying and then also what State Senator Ramos was able to do to bring other legislators onto the legislation, because I know that this was years in the making and that just suddenly the momentum picked up this year to allow it to get repealed.
Sure, I can pick up a little bit where you left off. So really important, right? You must be wondering, well, how can someone be considered a sex worker so much, you know, that a police officer just by looking at you decides that, you know, clearly you must be prostituting yourself, so I must arrest you. And the issue, of course, comes to be how a person is dressed. And unfortunately, you know, This oftentimes means short skirts. This oftentimes means tight clothing. And it's essentially that, the policing of the way a person chooses to dress. And, you know, the idea of self-expression and autonomy over our bodies is something that I think, you know, we're finally pushing the envelope in many ways. But, you know, before the law was repealed, 94% of those arrests were Black women. We don't know in disaggregated data how many trans Black women were included there. But yes, ground zero was East New York, close second being Jackson Heights, Queens. And we all know that the realities for many of our LGBTQ plus neighbors happens to be a life of discrimination, particularly when it comes to employment and housing. And so being arrested by police officers for loitering for the purposes of prostitution only makes life that much harder and keeps pushing people actually towards sex work. And here's where I actually want to talk about a little bit about the other bills that we've been working on, one of which was recently signed by Governor Kathy Hochul, which is the START Act. And that was a bill that allowed victims of human trafficking, not just sex trafficking, but human trafficking, because remember, farm workers are trafficked, nail salon workers many times are trafficked as well, for them to be able to vacate their records of any charges that stemmed from their trafficking. So if their trafficker asked them to forge someone's signature, or steal something, or hide a gun that had been used in another crime, these are all things that ordinarily would hold people back. And what we've been trying to do is allow us to break those cycles of having to choose this work, of making sure that, you know, it's work that is being done by your own volition and not coerced. Remember, returning to the values of a person's autonomy over their body. And let me tell you, these were some really difficult conversations to have with many of my fellow legislators, particularly the more conservative ones, particularly the male ones. But they were conversations that were very necessary. And at the end of the day, that's what politics is about. It's about, you know, creating the political will to create change through difficult conversations with folks who might not necessarily be on your side, but you know, for us to pull at their heartstrings, introduce them to people who have had these experiences, and hopefully get them on board for them to be able to live a better life. I am a cisgendered heterosexual woman. I was stopped and frisked when I was 20 years old in Jackson Heights, Queens, when police officers thought that my friends and I were working the night at 1 o'clock in the morning. We were on our way home back from Manhattan. We got out of the 74th Street station, and they told us all to stand against the wall, a very dirty wall, if you know the 74th Street station, and asked us to, you know, spread our legs. And it was, mind you, it was July, it was hot, our skirts were short, some of us were in shorts, but they felt up everything. And it was one of the most humiliating experiences that I've ever had in my life, and really showed me the empathy and the compassion that I believe every single one of my neighbors should have, particularly with sex workers, who I think have been marginalized for a very long time. And, you know, no matter how you feel about it, I think that there are basic things that we as a society need to come to an understanding of. And that is, it's called the oldest profession for a reason. It's not going anywhere simply because you don't like it. Someone will always be selling sex one way or another. And what we're trying to do is make sure that that only happens because they want to, not because anyone is forcing them to. And so, you know, in making sure that we're keeping sex workers safe from police violence and police brutality. I cannot tell you how many stories I would share with my colleagues of particularly trans Latinas in my district. I represent the largest number of transgender people in the country, actually. And it was really devastating to hear the lack of understanding, the lack of communication, the lack of training, the lack of humanity on behalf of the NYPD in dealing and treating people who are just trying to get by, are just trying to make a living. So I'm gonna kick it back to Jared so he can add a little bit more about, I guess, the coalition strategy that went behind repealing Walking While Trans and finally getting the START Act passed as we look forward to decriminalizing sex work altogether.
Yeah, and before really talking about the coalition, one thing I do want to acknowledge about what the coalition did is something that I can't even talk about completely, and that is what the trans and non-binary folks in the coalition did. And Candy wanted to be here today, but for health reasons she couldn't. This was a coalition that really sought to elevate the voices and the experiences of trans folks, of non-binary folks, of the people that were really targeted under the statute, and not just elevate them in superficial ways by having people like speak on a panel or speak to media, but really have people involved in policy decision making, really have people involved in talking to legislators, really have people just like involved in every meaningful aspect of the campaign. And that is so important. You know, I'm a former sex worker, but I was never targeted under this statute because I'm a cis man, and I just wouldn't have been. I'm just not of the demographic that's normally targeted for this. Someone like Candy, like T.S. Candy, who is just one of my heroes, and just one of the many, and Biane Garcia, and just so many other folks that really put so much work into this. You know, they can tell you everything about this bill that I can, and probably be a lot more interesting about while doing it. But something that they were able to do is that they really just weaponized their emotional trauma that they had from this. The sweat equity and labor and everything else that they put into this, the going up to Albany, and you know, it's one thing to go to your office in Albany and know that they have an ally. Not everyone's an ally. To be able to have to talk about your trauma, the story that you, I mean, I'm sure like you telling your story even today, even though it was years ago, it's not easy. Like, to have someone just even doubt your existence or your womanhood, and then to tell that story in front of people that are not allies at all, it is hard. And they did it week after week, going up to Albany, not really getting paid as well as they should be. So often, it was a lot. And so I really just want to acknowledge, you know, the true sacrifice and heroism that so many of our trans and non-binary allies put forward in this campaign. But yeah, so the coalition, the Decrim NY coalition kind of started or really ramped up in 2017. 2017 was just a really bad year for sex workers. The former president and also our allies in the US House and the US Senate, including my own beloved Bernie Sanders, voted for this bill called SESTA FOSTA, the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act, that was allegedly supposed to tackle online sex trafficking of children. But in reality, it just gave the government a whole bunch of tools to target sex workers. And these are things that sex workers told the government were very explicit what happened when this law was being debated. It's something that even the Department of Justice said would make it more difficult to fight online trafficking. And yet it was passed anyway with almost every senator, but one Democrat and one Republican, and then one person didn't vote for it. Just about everyone in the US House as well. That same year in 2017, an Asian massage parlor worker named Yang Song was sexually assaulted by Vice officers, complained about that assault, tried to get justice from that assault, at least just to get something to happen to that officer that sexually assaulted her at gunpoint. Nothing happened. That same officer then went back to rate the massage parlor where she was working, and rather than have to deal with that officer again, she jumped nearly 40 feet and ultimately died. So this is the backdrop in 2017. And while there's been, sex worker organizing, for decades now, these events really just galvanized the community, and it made people realize that we can't continue living this way. We have to stand up for ourselves. We have to do something to try to get the law changed more substantively. So after that, Decrim NY, the coalition that exists to decriminalize, destigmatize, and decarcerate sex work in New York State, the coalition formed. We founded a whole bunch of different campaigns, the campaign to pass the START Act, the campaign to decriminalize sex work, the campaign to defund the Vice Squad, and then of course the campaign around the Walking While Trans ban. All of those campaigns really started, and that's when the real work began. When we were talking to media, again, it was just because sex workers just for so much of our society haven't really been seen as human. And if they have been seen as human, they haven't been seen as humans that deserve rights and dignity and love. So just talking to steal one of the senator's words, our neighbors, and just showing them what we look like, whether we're current sex workers or former sex workers. It was talking to media. It was having a lot of really tough conversations. It was having a lot of really dehumanizing conversations.
It was electing a Democratic majority in the state Senate.
It was electing a Democratic majority in the state Senate, and not just Democrats in name only, but Democrats that actually care about their constituents. And that actually wasn't a political statement. It's just a practical fact. So yeah, there was just a lot of groundwork that went into it, a lot of base building that went into it, a lot of reminding communities, even I'm so happy that this is seen as an LGBTQ priority now, but it always wasn't. I can tell you as like a queer Afro-Latino, I haven't always seen myself reflected in what queer priorities are. And when it comes to sex workers, they certainly haven't. When it comes to trans folks, there are very, very explicit points in history where they haven't been. So it was building a coalition. It was making sure that immigration advocates knew that this should be their priority, that criminal legal system reform advocates knew that this should be their priority, that anyone that actually cares about elevating the human condition and whatever their particular field is, that this had to be their priority. So it was a lot of base building, it was some fundraising, it was having tough conversations with electeds, it was having tough conversations with the community, it was having tough conversations with the man that used to be governor, but ultimately, we got to where we are now.
Thank you so much. I really want to expand definitely on Decrim NY's coalition building, especially when it came to the pandemic onwards as well too. So what I definitely wanted to ask is, as far as the bill's repeal goes, between say the Black Lives Matter movement and the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020, and then also even the Black Trans Nation presser in September of 2020, which was hosted by T.S. Candy, do you think these events and just basically all these protests that were going around not only in New York City but throughout the country has definitely effectively pressured state legislators to effectively end the Walking While Trans ban?
Oh, absolutely. I think every time that people take to the streets to make themselves heard, to give visibility to their community, it always helps, not only in getting media attention, of course, but in helping elected officials see who's actually out there and who cares about this issue. It's different for me a little bit, I think. I'm born and raised in my district, in my little corner of Queens, and I've known sex workers my entire life. I've seen sex workers on Roosevelt Avenue my entire life. They're my neighbors. And this is, famously, I got asked the first interview that I ever did about Decrim, why it was that I was helping sex workers. And, the answer was just that. Sex workers are my neighbors. They are workers in my community at the most basic level, like everyone else. And just like a construction worker, and just like, someone sitting behind the desk, a sex worker too has the right to have, safe working conditions and living wages and a process in which to keep themselves safe. And that's ultimately, I think, what we set out to do. We know that interactions with police officers can turn very violent, even though we know that the NYPD, specifically the Vice Squad, has played a role in actually having sex worker rings in many of our communities namely mine in Jackson Heights. And there's an article in the New York Times from September of 2018 that busted up a few rings in my community where the police officers were very much active participants. And so the hypocrisy of it all, of course, is that who ends up bearing the brunt of this marginalization is, of course, Black and brown queer folk and women by and large. And so, to see people go out for George Floyd, for all, so many BLM protests that we've seen throughout the pandemic, I actually felt very heartened and encouraged by so many sex workers and the visibility of posters and actual campaign work. There is pride in being a sex worker in New York right now. And I think that can only create the safest possible conditions for everyone. I mean, sex is only really decriminalized in New Zealand, by the way, and I don't know that here in the panel we're gonna get it through the distinctions of legalization, decriminalization, other people believing in something called the Nordic model, which allows only for the decriminalization of sex from the seller and not the buyer, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because if you're surveilling the sex buyer, you're of course still surveilling the sex worker. And we want the sex worker to be able to report any violence against them. We want them to keep their agency and be their own boss of sorts, and make sure that if they're, just like any other business, if there's a lack of payment, they know where to go and be able to get every dime that they've earned. And so it's been really good to see throughout the pandemic how the pandemic alone was definitely a collective traumatic moment that I think made us all kind of slow down and reflect. But then tack on all of the police brutality, right? The lack of health care availability. I think all of these things have made us much more sensitive towards each other. And that, to me, as a former union organizer, means that it's a prime time for organizing. There are many more people talking about sex work than ever before. Even older people who traditionally, were not unwilling to have the conversation with me. I would get phone calls from constituents to the office complaining about the women who were walking down Roosevelt Avenue, at 10 o'clock at night, trying to find a friend. And now it's less so that. Little by little, I think people are starting to give each other a chance. And that, to me, I think allows us to even talk to some of the more conservative Democrats. We mentioned before the IDC. You see, before 2018, believe it or not, in the state of New York, we had a Republican majority in the state legislature, specifically the state Senate, for a very long time, for decades. And that did not allow us to move forward with a lot of progressive bills, as basic as codifying Roe v. Wade with the Reproductive Health Act, passing the DREAM Act, doing all sorts of stuff. Our ability to do this work changed when people woke up after 2016 and he who shall not be named was elected president. And even though he who shall not be named was still governor, we wanted to make sure that we're putting our best foot forward with our progressive politics and making sure that we were as inclusive and bold with an LGBTQ agenda that nobody had ever really seen before.
I'm actually going to ask a question that Jake Nill prepared, because I think it would be a perfect follow-up to what you just said. So to quote Black Youth Project 100 policy and advocacy manager Say Joseph, the larger conversation around decriminalization will require a lot more political education. Now, Decrim NY and State Senator Ramos are currently working on the full decriminalization of sex work in New York. Can you explain what full decriminalization is? I know you mentioned a lot of the terms, but can you explain for the audience what this entails and encompasses?
I can start, and then maybe my lawyer here can can fill in and add. So in New York, sex workers, of course, end up in that line of work for many reasons. And we are trying to create a system where we can differentiate between those who are being coerced to do the work so that we can help them get the services they need, and then also protect those who are doing it by choice. And so in creating those two categories, of course, the idea is to decriminalize the selling of sex in New York. I think for a long time have seen this as a very taboo subject. Of course, nobody likes to talk about sex, but we have to talk about sex, and we have to talk about safe sex. By the way, one bill that we didn't mention was repealing the condoms. It used to be that if you got stopped by a police officer, man or woman, and you were caught with a condom in your purse, that condom could be used as evidence of sex work, which is insane, right? I mean, maybe you're, off to meet up with your significant other, maybe you just keep it in your purse just in case you get lucky that night, right? Practicing safe sex is a thing, is what we want people to do. And so luckily, we actually were able to repeal that one too. But sorry, getting back to sex work, in essence, the industry is completely disorganized right now because everything that operates in the shadows always is. And I always like to point out to folks that if you can understand the concept of why legalizing marijuana made sense, even if you don't smoke it, even if you don't like it, even if you don't like the smell, this is actually not that much different. If you don't like it, you don't have to do it. But the idea is that everybody involved be able to fully participate in our economy. We would like to, of course, tax sex work interactions, but also in order to avoid so many people from getting involved in the criminal justice system simply because of a bodily function. And so for us, for the law to be able to distinguish when it's a consensual interaction between two adults is really important. I mean, that should be respected. The idea is for those consensual interactions to be legal, and why many of us fear what's called the Nordic model or called the equality model. I argue it's a misnomer. But where you're only decriminalizing those who are selling the sex, but not those who are buying the sex. And let me tell you, in New York, many people are buying sex. It does not matter how poor or rich you are. You might be a day laborer who's not here with your wife, or maybe you're not married yet. It can virtually be anybody. Even women buy sex sometimes. I always feel like I have to say that because it's shocking to some folks. But it's an industry that exists. It's an industry that's not going anywhere. It's an industry where we need to protect workers. And it's an industry where if we can zero in on making that differentiation within the law, we can actually have a concrete plan that does fight true human trafficking. Because I never want to diminish that, right? Human trafficking, sex trafficking does happen. We have to stop it. And this is the best way that we can keep people safe. I'm sure you have plenty to add, Jared.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, when we say that this is the best way to stop human trafficking and the best way to reduce harm, well, we know that because the Nordic model, the equality model, the in-demand model, I don't know, if I had a model that was working, I wouldn't change the name every 3 years. But, that model has been around for over 2 decades. And what do we see in Ireland, in parts of Ireland? What do we see in the Nordic countries? That it just doesn't work. The whole idea behind that model is that you can in-demand for sex work or you can reduce the supply for sex workers by ending demand for it. So the whole idea behind the bill is that if you just criminalize one side of the transaction, so if you just criminalize buyers so hard, they will eventually go away. And when the buyers go away, then yeah, you're shaking your head and like, you're right. Like that's a punchline, like they failed. But you know, that if buyers go away, then suddenly sex workers will go away too. Then no one will be selling sex anymore, which worked out really well for the drug war that we're celebrating the 50-year anniversary of this year. The reality is one, a lot of no in-demand policy is ever really coupled with how do you elevate the people that are selling sex. I can tell you when I was a sex worker, especially as a young person, but then also when I was a sex worker in law school, like I was doing it because I needed money. And so many sex workers, especially the most marginalized sex workers, the people that are the most criminalized, the reason that they're doing it's because they need housing, because they need a place to live, because they're trans Latina women that are excluded from every other, from the formalized economy, because they're Black women that, you know, might be making minimum wage, and the best way to make rent is to do sex work. So by just ending demand for it, you're not really ending sex work. What you're doing is you might be chasing a lot of the better clients away, and you're making workers have to resort to going to more dangerous clients, which is what we saw happen in France, which is what we saw happen in the Nordic countries. The other thing that I want to say is that whether it be UNAIDS, whether it be Amnesty International, whether it be the 250 scientists that sent a letter to the Biden administration calling on them to push for decrim, we all know that decrim, and we've seen this because decrim has been around since 2003 in New Zealand, that when you decriminalize sex work, when you take it out of the shadows, one, people aren't forced to operate in a black market economy, as the senator noted, but also a really isolated economy where sex workers don't really have access to a lot of the screening mechanisms that they use to keep themselves safe or to reduce harm, because I'm not going to pretend that it's a profession where there will never be harm, but to reduce harm at least, it gives them access to those screening mechanisms. And the final thing and it also gives them access to outreach. You know, we saw, this is something that T.S. Candy could certainly talk about, but during COVID, we just saw so many different organizations really provide just substantive outreach for sex workers that had lost all their clients because COVID, you know, to do sex work, you have to be less than 6 feet apart. So, but we saw so many organizations really pop up to make sure that people still had food and clothing and everything else that they needed to survive the pandemic. And the last note that I really, and Decrim really makes sure that those organizations can still survive and that people can access, can still have access. And the last thing that I really want to note is, and this is important, the idea behind the Nordic in-demand equality model bills is that they decriminalize sex work for the workers. How sex workers actually operate, it does nothing of the sort. How many of y'all have seen Pose? So the way that sex worker communities are organized in Pose is not all that dissimilar from how they're organized in real life, especially at that time, and even like when I was a teenager in the early 2000s. Blanca and what she did in Pose, for those who haven't seen it, which is thankfully most of you who have, but Blanca, why she was such a hero in Pose, and frankly, Marsha P. Johnson, the reason why she was such a hero is for operating Star House, for giving young sex workers food and clothing, and for talking about harm reduction strategies, and actually seeing their humanity and bringing them in. Felon, under 230.25 of the penal law, or at best, a misdemeanor under 230.20 for advancing prostitution. What the Nordic model does is they also criminalize sex workers that live together, that work together for safety, and then we call it landlords in the law, but in reality, the people that, and I'm not simping for landlords, I'm not doing that. But in reality, under 230.40 under the penal code, permitting prostitution, people that live together. Let's say that we were roommates, and if I was on the lease, and if the senator was just like kind of staying there on the couch.
Bottom bunk.
Exactly. So, and if the senator was just hanging out, but like even if we're both sex workers that sometimes work together, because I'm the leaseor, like I could be charged under this statute. So it is real. So when people tell you that the Nordic model or whatever they want to call their bill next week, sorry, not their bill, want to attack a bill. Whatever that movement wants to call their movement next week, whatever they call it, when they say that they are decriminalizing people that work together, it's not just that they are increasing surveillance, because when you're surveilling clients, you're also surveilling sex workers. It is also that they are very really criminalizing the most marginalized sex workers that are organizing to keep each other safe. So that's what their model is. Our model, the decriminalization model, again, just removes criminal penalties for the commercial sale of sex between consenting adults. It is not legalization, something that they have in Nevada and some other places, because when you have legalization, you have this whole legal paradigm that's really hard for the most marginalized workers to ever meet. So we talk, and if we have time, I'll talk about unlicensed massage a little bit, but if you're talking about non-citizens, if you're talking about like trans folks that maybe like it's hard to get a name change or something, those folks can never meet the dictates of legalization, and legalization also just leaves room for a lot of exploitation. Decrim means cops stay away from me, that this is a profession that has existed, you know, in time memoriam, that will continue existing, and people deserve to be able to do it safely, that organizations like Red Canary, that does amazing work, Brooklyn Swap, T.S. Candy's organization, Black Trans Nation, that they continue to be able to do the life-changing and transformative work without having, you know, the arm of the carceral state bearing over them and arresting them for just trying to show humanity for their coworkers.
Well, thank you both for sharing so much about what you've done, and also the personal stories that you have that are connected to the repeal of the walking while trans ban. That's been, I think, very informative for everyone in the audience. We both have a lot more questions asked, but I can feel the audience wanting to ask questions as well. So what I'm going to do now, the way this will work is I'm going to have a student open the Q&A, and then we have a staff member who will go around and hand a microphone to those who raise their hands to ask questions. We also, I think, have a function for people to ask questions who are attending the event virtually, and the staff member will look through those questions and ask them on behalf of those who are online. All right, so let's go ahead and begin with Ariana Ahmed. Ariana is the vice president of our Hunter College Student Union, and Ariana also worked with a local councilwoman on research behind the repeal of the walking while trans ban that was ultimately used in help advocating for the repeal.
Hello. Okay, sorry. Hello, thank you for having me here today. And one of the questions that I have for the panelists basically is that I work with a lot of like activists. I've researched so many statements that elected officials have like kind of put out against this law. And one of the common terms, one of the common phrases that I saw was that this law was basically a stop and frisk for trans women. I know we touched a little bit about on that using the personal story. Thank you for sharing that, by the way. But I also wanted to kind of ask, and this may sound like a rudimentary question at first, how do we prevent such laws from coming into fruition? Because I ask this because it happened in 1976, but the fact that it existed for 45 years untouched, I mean, of course not that untouched, we have gotten it off, but it just baffles me a little bit how it has gone for so long. How do we prevent such laws from happening in the future, is my question.
Well, you know, I think laws are largely products of their time, right? Legislatures pass laws as they deem necessary to the occurrences of our daily life now. We are not as we were not as open or educated about sex work, the LGBTQ movement. We were in a totally different place in 1976, New York City, right? I mean, the city was going through a deep financial catastrophe. A lot of areas were blighted areas, and the city's economy was really run down. There was very few economic opportunities, which led many women and other people and LGBTQ people to pursue work in the sex trades. And, you know, never forget that this is a country that was founded on puritanical beliefs, and that many people with it, you know, still believe that their personal beliefs should somehow should somehow also be reflected in the law, right? I mean, we have a separation of church and state for a reason, or at least we say that we have one. And I think that as we begin to elect more progressive representatives, we actually, I think, are trying to make sure that that separation is actually true. I mean, all I want is for each of my neighbors to give us their best. That's actually at the most fundamental level. I want every single human being to feel that they've been able to meet their potential, that they are happy, that they are able to spend time with their loved ones, that they don't have to overwork themselves in order to provide for themselves, to simply survive. I mean, the rat race in New York ain't nothing. You know, getting ahead here is really, really hard. And unfortunately, there are too many conditions that set others even further back. So, I mean, I don't know that you can prevent bad laws. I mean, you can with organizing. When you hear of them, you organize around them. You certainly go out and vote. But right now what we're trying to do is pass good laws, getting rid of the bad ones, correcting our course, and hopefully, putting ourselves on a path to a much more equitable society.
You know how to turn it on? Is it on? Okay. First of all, thank you for being here. I've lived not on this block, but the block through that wall for the last 45 years. And this gives me sort of a sense of community, and I appreciate that. Until last week, I was on grand jury duty for 4 weeks at the county, Manhattan, Roosevelt Island level. I learned Roosevelt Island is a part of Manhattan, not Queens. I didn't know that.
That's okay.
So let's say you're arrested at 65th and Park for selling and or purchasing sex. Is that a city law, a state law? Like, what would have to change? Like, can the state pass laws that affect the city? Can the city pass its own
Yes,
laws?
the state legislature has purview over the state's penal code. Yes.
Okay, so it's not a city thing, it's a state, even though a city police officer might arrest someone, it's a state law.
Municipal law enforcement groups enforce state law.
Okay.
Yes.
Can I add something
Yes.
real quick to that? Yeah, absolutely. It is a state law. Also, probably wouldn't happen here because all the sex work arrests happen in 5 zip codes in New York City. But more importantly, and thank you so much for that question, because it can be confusing because you'll see a lot of city electeds talk about decriminalizing sex work as well. But that is also important because something that the city does do is that they allocate $18.2 million per annum to NYPD's Vice Squad. That's $18.2 million plus another $2 million of overtime. While it is a state law to criminalize sex work, it is a city decision to allocate so much money and so many resources to the policing of sex workers. At the same time that we launched Decrim NY, we had this blueprint for what the city could do to actually adequately care for sex workers instead of arresting them. We wanted money to go to the city sex worker service center. I cannot say that again fast. We got a little bit of money to go there. We wanted a physical space for the sex worker service center. We wanted to make sure that there was competent services for Chinese-speaking workers and for Korean-speaking workers, which you didn't really get. There's just a lot that the city could do instead of policing. And that's not even just sex work-specific stuff. That $18.2 million that the city uses for sex workers, that could go to, say, housing for LGBTQ youth, who we know are incredibly likely much more likely than their cis peers to trade sex, about 8 times more likely. It's a city decision.
So where does this stand now at the state level? Is there a law, is there a bill going through? I mean, what's happening?
Yes, there is a bill that has been introduced in the state senate now for a few years to decriminalize sex work. It's carried by my colleague, State Senator Julia Salazar from Brooklyn. I am the prime co-sponsor of the bill. Julia represents East New York. I represent Jackson Heights, two of the areas where there's the most prevalence of sex work and the most criminalization on record of sex work in various ways. And so, you know, we're taking it upon ourselves to work with the coalition, to work with Decrim NY and with our neighbors to educate as many people as we can so that we can hopefully make it a reality this year.
Thank you.
Yes. Oh, and for those interested in the assembly, it's carried by Richard Gottfried, who is an assemblyman not too far away from here, over on the west side.
Hello. First, just want to thank Jared and Senators Ramos and T.S. Candy for all your incredible work on these issues over the past few years. Before I ask my question, on the point about the Vice Squad, I wanted to recommend to folks who want to learn more about what we can do at the city level. If you Google ProPublica and Vice Squad, you'll come across some extraordinary and harrowing reporting about how the Vice Squad has terrorized communities with its policing, particularly policing of sex work. My question is going back to the proposed legislation on the Nordic model, equality model, whatever one wants to call it. It seems, Senator, that you probably have many colleagues who are generally progressive Democrats, but who have been persuaded that this is the way to go. Yes. And my question for you and for Jared is, what can we all do to persuade these otherwise well-meaning progressives that this is a very flawed model? I have to imagine they've done some level of homework. They've maybe even met with yourself and Jared. They've maybe even met with sex workers. What can we be doing to continue to pressure them to understand that this is not the right way to go and that full decriminalization is a far better outcome?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, to be transparent with you, we are expecting the Nordic model bill to be introduced by State Senator Liz Kruger, in whose district we're standing right now. And she has been working with the National Organization for Women and Sanctuary for Families. And we would probably need another few hours to talk about white feminism. But that, I think, is really what it boils down to. They do not want to hear or have conversations where they're truly listening to people who are doing sex work by choice. And nobody here is denying the realities of what the sex industry look like. We just believe that actually by utilizing the law to protect them, we can incentivize those who are being coerced to come forward without fear of retaliation. That's the biggest thing. I mean, you know, I've been calling for the defunding of the Vice Squad for many years now, before the word defunding was even such a buzzword. Because the Vice Squad, I mean, you heard Jared relay the story of Yang Song, a massage worker who was living and working in Flushing, who plummeted, to her own death, unfortunately, running away from that Vice Squad police officer. I've had the Vice Squad come into Jackson Heights and bust up a, young high school queer party where, a party room was rented out for them to create the safe space for LGBTQ youth, and yet the Vice Squad, by the way, wearing Trump lanyards, walked in and busted up the party and made everybody fear for their lives. I got the phone call right away, but we were very nervous in all of those 20 minutes as everything went down that it would be another modern day Stonewall. And nobody should live in fear that way. not simply for existing, not simply for being themselves, for being their best selves, for having fun, right? For having the audacity to look for joy, to create joy within their own community. And unfortunately, I mean, that's what the NYPD does. That's what the Vice Squad does and has been doing for a very, very long time. So I think we need my colleague and that group of advocates to hear stories as to why it is that people end up choosing this line of work, whether they like it or they just didn't see any other recourse, but they're doing it because they want to. In the conversations and meetings that I have had with them, because I have sat down with them, they cannot seem to see a world where people want to pay for sex and it's not a violent act. They cannot seem to separate the violence from the sex, which, I mean, begs a whole different other set of questions for me as a woman, but it's an unfortunate truth in just understanding where it is that they're coming from. I mean, they really do think that by making it harder for people to sell sex, that suddenly it's going to disappear. After more than 2 millennia, I don't know how that is actually anywhere near a realistic expectation. You know, people have bodily functions. You know, I know Nadia over there is filming, but people need to come. You know, and we would be better served actually if people are able to release tension and really fulfill their bodily needs. This is actually very medical and scientific in a way if you think about it. You know, and you know, if they don't have a significant other or they're just looking to have fun, people should be able to do that, know where to go do that in a safe place. Okay, you know, if I was married and I had you know, and my man wasn't pleasing me, which he is, in case he's listening, but if he wasn't, and I wanted, I know we get a little shy, but we have to talk about these things, guys. You know, there should be a place where I can go and get all the stuff done that I want to get done to me. You know, and I should be able to do that without getting in trouble and making sure that nobody, you know, no STDs are being carried out. But these are the reality of the things. And again, if you don't like it, you don't have to do it, right? But the idea is that if you like it and you want to do it, that you're able to do it safely, right?
This is a question from one of our virtual attendees joining us on Zoom tonight, from Sarah Mather. She asks, why do you think the queer community has been reticent to address the specific issues that face the trans community and those in the sex working community? How are you working to combat this?
So I'll say that the queer community was slow on this, and it's because a lot of that's because of how criminalization works. You know, I have friends that are sex workers that live in Hell's Kitchen, that live on the Upper West Side, that live in some of the better zip codes, or the better, wealth does not, like, obviously, you know, mean whether something's better or not, but some of the wealthier zip codes in the city, they're not really worried about being criminalized, not at all. The criminalization comes from, again, like 5 zip codes. The criminalization is of trans Latino women in the Senator's District. It's from folks in East New York. It's from people in the South Bronx. And so for so much of LGBTQ activism, we just ignore the people that might not be funders to some of the bigger LGBTQ organizations. And so for so much of our existence, those folks have been just easy to ignore. And so that's why sex work and trans issues just haven't really been elevated. Something that I always think about is that, you know, on Sylvia Rivera's deathbed, Sylvia Rivera, of course, a huge trans Latina icon, on her deathbed, she just asked that, I don't want to even say the gay community, because it was gay men, we can be trash often. It was so much of the gay community she just asked, don't forget us when you're passing the Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act. This was in 2002. GENDA didn't pass until 2019. Like 17 years, we just ignored that community. And so that's just so indicative of how so many LGBTQ movements have gone. Now, I will say for sex work, every single queer or trans political club, except for GLID, is not only supporting DCRIM, but has added it to their questionnaires. The Human Rights Campaign and Lambda Legal and all the queer organizations are doing it. And that's because of, again, the bravery of people like T.S. Candy and Biane Garcia and Mateo Guerrero and so many others that have really told their stories and have really made people see the humanity of sex workers. But it's also, frankly, Rent Boy. If you want to talk about, making sure that people can come safely, Rent Boy did it really effectively. This is a website that existed for a number of years, and it facilitated online sexual transactions. It was escorting, but everyone knew what that meant. Rent Boy provided a lot of HIV awareness for sex workers. It provided harm reduction training for sex workers, sexual health training. It actually incentivized them to go to those trainings so they can get money off of their monthly fee to advertise by going to those trainings. Everyone knew that Rent Boy was providing a real service. However, in 2015, the government went in and they shut them down anyway because they could. When the judge was sentencing Jeff Harant, the CEO of Rent Boy, the judge even noted that she was giving him the mandatory minimum, another discussion, but she was giving him the mandatory minimum because she had to give him some sentence. But she even noted during sentencing that he was providing a harm reduction service. Rent Boy was really used by a lot of rich gay white dudes. And so when that happened, these conversations that we're having now, they became a lot easier with the LGBTQ community to the point where I can say that I actually have a lot of pride that the queer and trans community still has a way to go, but is at least recognizing that this is a priority issue, not just marriage.
That's great. We're pretty much out of time, right, Erin? But
Yes.
should we do one more quickly from the virtual audience or from in the room? Up to you, Erin.
Yeah, I actually see someone in the back. You have a question?
I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. But basically, I'm a strong believer that in order to appropriately critique existing structures of oppression, we also need the possibility to imagine a new world, right? And so my question to y'all is, what does the liberation of sex workers look like? How do you imagine a world with justice and joy for us?
Well, you asked the chair of the labor committee. I'm going to say, that I see it as an organized workforce. I would love to see a sex workers union. I would love to see unionized sex work here in New York, where they're calling their own shots, where they're the ones who tell us how we keep them safe, how we can help them do their job better, if they're interested in leaving that work, perhaps the community can find a pathway to other opportunities. But ultimately, and it goes back to all of the groups who are working on that other bill that we don't like, we talk about, especially now with the SCOTUS decision, right, talking about my body, my choice when it comes to abortion. My body, my choice, my body, my choice. Women love saying this, particularly white women. It's probably the #1 polling issue. And I cannot tell you how they insist on being disconnected from this concept when it comes to talking about sex work. It can't just be my body, my choice when it comes to my, medical decisions. It's my body, my choice. I decide how I dress. I decide what I do with my body. I decide who touches it. I decide, that very basic autonomy is what we're trying to protect here. And I think that is first and foremost the value that needs to be respected in thinking of this group of workers as the workforce that they are, right? Helping them figure out a system where they can report unsafe working conditions, where they can, I mentioned it before, report that they haven't been paid for wages earned, right? Like any other work. So in just thinking about, right, the basic things that we think about other workers and actually it was mentioned in my introduction, I passed the Farm Worker Fair Labor Practices Act in 2019 after many decades. Very briefly, thank you, I know we're short on time, but hey, so farm workers in New York were left out of the Constitution way back when because most farm workers were black sharecroppers, right? And so because of that, they were denied very basic work protections that we enjoy today. The right to a day off, the right to unemployment assistance, the right to disability, the right to overtime pay, and the right to organize a union. We changed that in 2019. I actually just met last week the first workers to ever organize, the first farm workers to ever organize in the history of New York State. Very happy. It's called Pindar Vineyards out in Suffolk County. So when you're planning your birthday party, please, if you're thinking of having a vineyard birthday party, do it union, go to Pindar out in Suffolk County and support them. I want to do this very same thing for sex workers. How do we make sure perhaps it's a sex workers' bill of rights, right? Make sure that they do have a right to a day off. Make sure that they have access to all of the services that they need. They should be able to get unemployment insurance just like everybody else. The formula is actually not as abstract because what we're looking for is for them to be treated as any other worker because they provide a good and a service like any other worker. Yeah.
Do you want to say?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as far as sex workers being able to unionize, that's a given. For every workers' rights movement in this country, unions have just been at the backbone of it. Very biased statement. I used to run a union, but still, it's so important. But then also, we need to destigmatize sex work as well. The decriminalization is imperative, but it's probably still a few years away. The decriminalization also matters because the Stop Violence of the Sex Trades Act, not only does it decriminalize it, but it also expunges old records. So that means that people will no longer be encumbered by the immigration and housing and employment consequences. But we really need to destigmatize it in a way that people can know that they do sex work and they're not being seen as less than because they do it. I'm sure that there's probably sex workers in here. On Twitter, I'm not asking you to tout yourself by any
Twitter
means.
is a hotbed.
Twitter is,
Twitter's lit
go into my
when there's
mentions.
sex
I get called a
workers.
trafficker all the time for
Right?
wanting to liberate, sex workers. But in very real ways, I get contacted on Twitter quite frequently by college students that are sex workers because tuition is high. I get contacted by people that are in law school and are trading sex in law school, like I did. And they were trying to figure out, how do I navigate character and fitness without lying, but without ruining my career? There are 3 male attorneys in the city that are former sex workers. All of us are out. There's more that are not out, but we're out. There are a lot of female attorneys that cannot come out because of misogyny. There are female politicians and even just candidates that just say that they're supportive of sex work, and their Twitter comments are just awful. It is, the stigma behind it while we still think that people are less than because they're trying to survive capitalism by working, we'll just never have a society where everyone is actually treated equally. So before someone asks, what can you do to actually elevate sex workers, you yourselves, is to talk about them as humans. Like jokes about the classes of jokes that I hate the most are prison rape jokes. And jokes about sex workers not having autonomy over their bodies, whether that be, that you can do whatever you want to them, or, I don't need to get into it, but just the whole range of those jokes. Call your friends out on their bullshit when they say that. Recognize, if you see sex worker organizers, if you see Decrim, if you see us, canvassing in your neighborhood, pick up some pamphlets and join us. Or at the very least, just say a kind word to a sex worker. You have no idea how much that can just help someone's day. I can't tell you how much I am going off on someone on Twitter and they're going off on me and I'm kind of enjoying it a little bit. But at the end of the day, because I think that our side is the righteous one, but although they talk like it, but just that little bit of kindness of you are seen, you are valid, telling sex workers that, especially people like T.S. Candy, who does the exact same work that I'm doing without needing the law degree, but doesn't get paid healthcare, has had an issue finding a new job because of her activism and because of how vocal she's being. just treating people with kindness and like humans is something that we shouldn't have to say in 2021. But if you do it, and if you go that just extra step when it comes to a sex worker, you can really be making such a difference for the movement as far as keeping people going.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. Yes. Yeah, this has been just an excellent event. Thank you both for taking the time to participate, and thank you, Jake Nill, for
Yes,
co-moderating.
And I definitely want to give a shout out to TS Candy also as well for all of her work in this organizing efforts. By the way, if you follow her on social media, today is her birthday. If
Yeah.
you want to wish her a happy birthday as well.
Yeah, we do have a reception following this event. So if you'd like to join us for a few minutes for snacks, it'll be upstairs in the Four Freedoms room. I'd like to now just end the event by thanking the panelists, thanking the audience, and a special thank you to our staff, especially Mac Barrett and the director of the Roosevelt House, Harold Holzer, for helping us put this event on. And I look forward to talking with you all more in a couple of minutes.